So thanks everyone for joining us for this session on the energy story. And to Sophie Lamben's point about bringing in the heart, we want to really start getting into the moral arguments here as well. So the energy story, how will we finally draw the curtain on the fossil fuel era? So I'm Charles Perry, as was just said. I'm a partner of Rise, and we are a purpose and sustainability advisory firm for mainly corporate clients. And I'm delighted to be joined by David Shukman, by Adenika, and by Harriet on our panel. So we're going to try and make this a audience participative session. So we'd love to have you involved. We'll probably do 20 to 30 minutes of conversation over here, and then we'll turn to you and try and bring you into the conversation. So I'm going to start with David. Now, David, so you have been a reporter at the BBC for about 40 years. And can you tell us, when you first started, were you worried about climate change?
So, yeah, I started, I don't know if this thing is working. Hello, just testing. Forgive me. Is that better? No, the light hasn't come on. Hello? Oh, there we go. As a broadcaster, I might have known that, right? Forgive me. Yes, in the BBC for 38 years. I left after COP26. For the previous 20 years, I'd been reporting on climate change, environment, sustainability. And I began that role cynically, like many journalists. I mean, I was broadly sympathetic to environmental campaigns like Save the Whales, Save the Rainforest. But if you really pressed me, I wasn't convinced by environmental slogans. Were things really that bad? And so I set out to report on the front lines of climate research. And I had a series of trips to the Arctic 15 times, to the Amazon rainforest 4 times, to different parts of the world to find out what the scientists were finding out. And crucially, what they were able to say with certainty and what they still weren't sure about. And do you know what? Each of those trips was like being slapped in the face by Mother Nature saying, do you now get it? Do you now get it? I mean, look at the pace of the ice melting in Greenland. Look at the scale of deforestation in the Amazon. And these were, for me, very formative and moving experiences. I mean, to see one part of the Amazon going there repeatedly over a course of 15 years and just seeing noisy, dark, vibrant rainforest become silent monoculture was just profoundly moving. Or with the ice of Greenland, going to the same spot 15 years apart and seeing how you go from ice everywhere to bare rock, and scientists in tears at the effect of that. So, yeah, that was my learning.
Thank you for that, David. Adenika, so you're from Nigeria, and can you tell us, I mean, you started, I think, the Climate Strike schools for climate in Nigeria. How did you start getting involved in climate activism when you were at school?
Okay, so I schooled in the food basket of the nation in Nigeria, and I get to see the real impact of the climate change crisis because it's not far-reaching, it's near-reaching. And then I noticed that the climate change crisis is leading to the conflict between the farmers and the cattle rearers. And then I needed to educate the people because where I schooled, like, nobody knows about climate change. And so I say that it's very important for me to educate the people because I believe that if you don't know that a problem exists, you can't find a solution to it. And because we all know that a problem exists, that is why we are all here. And so that was my first thing, to keep educating people to understand. And since then, I've get to do several activities in the local space, in regional, national, and also at the global space to keep raising awareness, advocacy. And then I became an ecofeminist, a climate justice activist, and now an Arctic angel with the global choice. And so I'm seeing climate change at different lenses.
And can I just also ask you, Adenika, did you actually meet Greta at some point? When was that? Can you just explain?
Yeah, at COP25 in Spain, Madrid, 2009. Then I was a Nigerian youth delegate, and it was nice meeting with her because I started the Fridays for Future in Africa first, and it's so amazing that it keeps spreading around other African countries, including Nigeria at large, because I wanted to see young people participating in the decision making of not their future alone, but today. And we could see many young people out there trying to champion climate justice.
Thank you so much. So turning to you, Harriet, I mean, you've been a leader in social and environmental justice for a long time, and you're chief exec of Ashton. But before that, I mean, tell us, you were chief exec of Fair Trade Foundation, of Fair Trade International. You mobilized the fair trade movement. I mean, when did you start getting into, let's say, social and environmental campaigning?
Thank you, Charles. And can I just say, this is the first time that I've ever had Boris Johnson as a warm-up act for a panel. So I think that must be your power, Charles. Congratulations. It's absolutely brilliant. We must do it more often. And I actually just thought it's really interesting as well, driving around here in Sharm el-Sheikh, that you go past first the dinosaurs, and then you go past symbols of the Roman Empire and symbols of the Egyptian Empire. And I think we're in a moment in time, Charles, when we're teetering between two worlds. We're teetering between the old fossil fuel world, which belongs with those dinosaurs, and we haven't yet managed to knit together the story of the world we're going into, the sort of lush, green, future, regenerative economy. And that's where I think it's really interesting. How can we, as social movements, get better at telling those stories, giving everyone a peek through the letterbox into what the future will look like and inspiring people? I think we've won the argument on the facts and the figures. We've sort of beaten people over the head with them, but we haven't yet managed to project that future vision. And I think that's something is what I learned from Fair Trade and I learn now at Ashton, is the power of the living alternative, of showing how it could look different so that people are inspired and don't think, oh, I've got to give up this. Actually, I'm going to gain. The climate future will be actually better place to live because it will be not only tackling the climate crisis, but also tackling inequality, which an earlier panel was talking about the twin crisis. I would actually say you've also got to add in conflict and therefore the high number of refugees. And the sort of perma-crisis has become one of the words of the moment, and we've got to find the solutions that address all of those too.
And you're also chief exec of an organization on conflict resolution. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I used to work at an organization called International Alert that was seeking to address the fact we now have more conflicts than at any time since the Second World War. And obviously Ukraine is very present in people's minds in Europe, but we mustn't overlook the conflicts that have been happening, whether in DR Congo, whether in Ethiopia or in Yemen. Conflict after conflict, which means we have more people who are refugees than ever before. And interestingly, actually, Charles, refugees are among the people who have the least access to energy. So in Africa, there are 600 million people at least who have no access to electricity at all. And among those, refugees are the sort of furthest. They are really the last mile, the last feet of the last mile. But just last week, I was in Kakuma refugee camp, which is in the northeast of Kenya. It's hot, it's dry, it's very, very poor. 200,000 refugees in a camp. And when I say camp, I mean barbed wire. Some of them live there decades. In camps, 90% of people have no access to energy. But one of the people who lived in Kakuma refugee camp, Innocent Chilomba, he's a refugee from Congo. He left Congo, where he was studying electrical engineering. He was determined to finish his degree, trying to do it with no access to power, which of course means no access to the internet. And so he struggled himself to get his qualifications, and from that he was then absolutely determined that he would help others in Kakuma get access. So using solar energy to power Wi-Fi access, he's now bringing the Wi-Fi to 10% of Kakuma refugee camp. And as he sort of says, if you're in the camp, you're stuck. You can't leave. I mean, it really, there are guards in the camp. You can't come and go. But through the internet, you can access the whole world. And so his ambition is now, how can we make sure that all people in Kakuma have access to power, clean power and Wi-Fi, and indeed that all refugees have access to that. And I think it's those kind of inspiring, positive stories that is part of the climate story.
Okay, and so we know that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and we know what we've got to do. I mean, we all, I think, agree on the problem, and the solution is also pretty simple. I mean, the problem is too many people burning too much fossil fuels, and the solution is, clearly, we have to wean ourselves off our addiction, as Boris Johnson said, to burning fossil fuels. Now, thinking about other movements that have been successful, so we've had the suffragettes, we had the civil rights, the anti-apartheid movement, the abolitionists, William Wilberforce, movements that have been successful in history. Now, how successful do you think we're being in terms of this movement as a social movement, David?
Well, I think it's spasmodic. I think it's gaining ground. And I think there are powerful forces trying to derail it. So that's a kind of a mixed bag kind of answer. I mean, for every step forward, there's pushback of different kinds. And it's very striking to see. I'm sure we've all in this room, by advocating clean energy, for example, or advocating reductions in carbon emissions, attracted hostility. I mean, I don't know whether in Nigeria you've had that, but there are powerful voices that don't like this agenda and are not shy of throwing out accusations. And I've had all kinds of stuff, and I know I'm not alone. So I think we have to be, and you translate that to the context of a COP, and we know that for every national delegation pushing the agenda, striving to improve the finance or the carbon reduction targets, trying to be progressive, there are other governments, there are other delegates, there are lobbyists trying to slow it all down. And so I think it's not as with the anti-slavery movement, it's steps forward and a step back. And there's a massive push. There are powerful forces of resistance, if you like. And eventually one hopes that they will be overcome. I mean, the merchants of Liverpool supported the southern pro-slavery states in the American Civil War. No? Eventually, they were overcome. The southern states were overcome, and the merchants had backed the losing side. And I think there are breakthrough moments, and we've all got to just live in hope that the right positive forces will achieve those tipping points.
And, a huge amount of sacrifice by people who are willing to put themselves at risk. I mean, William Wilberforce died 1 month before the 1833 Abolitionist Act was actually passed. So he didn't actually see the results of his life's work in the House of Commons in the UK. Adenika, I mean, how do you think we can accelerate our phasing out of fossil fuels? I mean, in Nigeria, it's so ingrained in everything. How do you think we can get off fossil fuels?
Yeah, I think the fossil fuel, they are trying to buy the mind of the government or buy their conscience with money, because as a developing nation, I mean, we need finance for many things, and then they are here to offer money to degrade or destroy our landscape. Maybe let me tell you a quick story, because I'm from Nigeria, and then we have this Ogoni issue, which they call the Niger Delta crisis, and every year, or each year, about 260,000 barrels of oil spillage happens to their landscape. So you could imagine those people doesn't have livelihoods because we depend on agriculture for food, for employment, and the rest. And so invariably, it means that many people are unemployed, and then it led to the rise of militant group in the region to rebel against the government for their rights because it's affecting their human rights. They don't have access to food, to education, to safe drinking water, and definitely it affects unborn and born children. Because I came to understand the fact that for every child being given birth, it poses a serious environmental risk to them. And this has been an ongoing crisis since the discovery of oil in Nigeria and since Nigeria left agriculture for fossil fuel. And so that is why we need to keep the fossil fuel in the ground, because imagine in Nigeria, for some people, they can't afford a meal, a daily meal or a square meal. And so it matters a lot for us to subsidize renewable sources of energy, because, the fossil fuel is being subsidized. So if we could subsidize renewable sources of energy or clean sources of energy below the level of fossil fuel, I think many people will buy in, because I go for communities advocacy, and I get to hear the thoughts of people. They are ready to change their behavior, but then they need an energy that is safe, clean, affordable for them to be able to get it. Because someone that can't afford a square meal or a daily meal, he can't even get access to get affordable energy sources. Okay. And looking at it from the Arctic point of view, that for every tons of carbon emitted, 3 meter squares of ice is melted. So it really tells on the sea level rise. Because in Lagos State, reports have it that by the end of the century, it will be covered with water. And it's already a reality, because maybe many of you saw what happened in Nigeria recently, the flood. That out of 36 states, 33 were submerged with water. And so we might have loss of identity, cultures, imagine things that cannot be repaired with money. And that is why we need to phase out the fossil fuel industries through subsidy of renewable and clean sources of energy.
Thank you very much, Adenika. You talked about the economic argument there in terms of affordability of clean energy and making it cheaper to buy clean energy than fossil fuels. What about the moral argument? Is it now becoming morally unacceptable to carry on burning fossil fuels if we know that it's killing people, both from an air quality health point of view as well as from a climate change point of view? Harriet, talk about the moral case.
Well, I think it is morally unacceptable for those of us who live in the wealthy world, in the rich world, that are causing the majority of the carbon. We absolutely have a moral imperative to cut back. And given that Africa contributes only 4% to all the carbon emissions, I think it would be a hard argument to make it here. I think it's for us in the wealthy world with the highest carbon footprints in the world who have a moral imperative. But even in the UK, for example, I don't think morality and wagging a moral finger is the way to win support for our movements. I think the way is to appeal to what it is that are people's own priorities. Actually, what you were saying, Adenika. And people's first priorities are always to look after their family, to feed their family, and then come their wishes to contribute to positive change in their community or on the climate. And so that's why I think what we believe is putting the argument in Africa, for example, that access to energy will generate jobs. It's an opportunity. You're not giving up anything. It's not a moral thing you have to do. It's actually an opportunity to generate 14 million jobs in Africa by 2030 if we switch to renewables. And for every direct job in clean energy, it's thought to generate 5 jobs indirectly, because access to clean energy enables people to run a business, to use solar power to irrigate their fields, to have a shop and run a mill in the village. And these are concrete examples where actually you get that economic positive offshoot of switching to renewables. And so I think that's the way we need to get cleverer at making the argument, not to ourselves, it's to engage everybody. And I just wanted to come back to your point about social movements, because that's really interesting, having worked in peace building. Peace building really is your iconic David against Goliath. But I think the environmental movement is enormous. It is really, this is Goliath slugging it out against Goliath. We have enormous allies right through, from some governments to some businesses to some sections of civil society. It doesn't mean it's won, but I think it's eminently winnable.
And obviously we have to connect the environmental and the social movement, and also the climate movement and the ecological movement, right? So it's a movement of movements that we really need to bring together to mobilize enough human capital, if you like, to reach that tipping point. I mean, how do you think we could get better at doing that? Because we've been talking about this issue for a long time, but we don't seem to be mobilizing enough people, David.
I think it's a really difficult question, and in newsrooms, I know this is agonized over, what cuts through. And picking up on what you've both said, Harriet and Adenika, in a way, the moral argument is arguably, sadly, the least effective. I think we're in an era where, for whatever reason, cost of living pressures, all kinds of political upheavals, uncertainty, where it's pragmatic, close to home rationale that's going to cut through. So whether it is parents being concerned about the air their children are breathing in a dirty, polluted street, whether it's a farming family having trouble growing enough crops because the soils are denuded and poisoned. I think these are the things which will cut through on a perhaps a personal level. And then on a corporate level, as we see, I mean, my first COP was COP11. You didn't see many corporates there. So now it's a different story completely. And with this greater engagement, which I broadly welcome, of course, comes a lot of greenwashing. So I think the really key thing is to see what companies are actually doing. And I'm finding in my conversation, what cuts through at a company level is, again, pragmatic. Okay, you can try the humanitarian up to a point. They may want to spend some money on a new forest or whatever. But you talk to them about supply chains getting disrupted. I mean, Bangkok's industrial area was underwater for weeks in 2011. That's where Japanese car companies get components made. That's where the BBC got its cameras from. And now once these supply chains get disrupted, it really brings it home to people. And I think that's a change of emphasis.
Okay, but just to bring in a little story at this point, I mean, taking us back to 1800, actually what was quite interesting was the relationship that changed between William Wilberforce and the abolitionists and the British East India Company. Charles Grant was the chief exec of the British East India Company. And as you can imagine, they were arch enemies at one point, right? But it got to a thawing of the relationship when Wilberforce managed to persuade Charles Grant that there was a better way. And the steam engine had been invented, of course. So the door was knocking on the industrialized era. And he said, well, why do we need human energy when we can have machines? The steam engine's been invented. And Charles Grant actually agreed with that there was a better way. So the British East India Company started to be less obstructive as long as they could then try and move in a direction of the new opportunity emerging out of industrialization. So isn't there a bit of an analogy here? Because what happened there was a convergence of the moral and the economic case. Adenika.
Okay, I think just to bring to notice concerning, I think I find this kind of tricky when we talk about carbon markets. Because I believe that the moment you place a price on carbon, it becomes legal. And so you make it like a trading form. That doesn't really solve the climate change crisis. Because rather than you trading carbon, because I got to find out like the way it works is in a form that if you can make use of your carbon permits, then they could buy that carbon permit to keep emitting. But that doesn't solve the problem of climate change. It could make climate justice impossible. It could make places that contribute the lowest to now become the big contributor of carbon emissions. So why can't we all go green together to make climate justice equal, not the business as usual? I think during the COVID-19, I was campaigning for a green recovery, but now it's now the business as usual. We've gone back to the business as usual, which is unfair because country like mine is being eaten the most by the climate change crisis, and not just facing a single crisis, but multiple crises. There is flood, drought, food insecurity, like different crises that we need to deal with. We are just hit by floods and now facing drought, so many crises. And so I don't buy into the carbon market because I believe it's not a way out. Everybody should go green. And I also believe that the outcome of COP shouldn't be influenced by big polluters. I think the better we phase out the fossil fuel, the less the loss and damages.
Okay, so the fossil fuel companies are making a fortune. I mean, I'll be transparent. I worked for BP for 6 years, from 2000 to 2006. And in those years, I was what's now known as an entrepreneur trying to move the needle within a big corporation on driving sustainability. And I ended up running the renewable energy business there for the last 2 years. But look at BP now, right? I mean, making a fortune, Shell, they just announced their quarterly profits, right? While the cost of living is going up for so many people who are struggling, there doesn't seem to be any penalty at all for these oil and gas companies. They are getting away with murder, aren't they, Harriet?
Literally, as well as metaphorically, and absolutely, I agree that we should tax them. And even some of the fossil fuels companies have accepted they should get big windfall tax for these windfall profits, that they didn't do anything to earn these extra profits. It was simply what was happening on global markets. And it actually underlines the importance of the switch to a low carbon society, which undoubtedly will happen and will come. The question is just whether it comes in time before the catastrophes get worse, but that switch must also be to more distributed energy. The problem with fossil fuels is also that they are so concentrated in the hands of very few unbelievably powerful companies who then, of course, have influence over the policymakers. And what we clearly need is the kind of international regulation of multinational companies that was talked about back in the day, probably back in the day when you were at BP. And we need to bring those issues back up the agenda, but also make sure that the switch to renewable is to distributed rural energy that is then much closer to people, and will also help tackle the inequality gaps, which again have been completely fed by fossil fuels.
I'm going to go to the audience next after David. So, David.
So just to build on your point, Harriet, I mean, years and years ago, like 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion in the UK about carbon capture. And it seemed to add up. You had pipelines already running out under the North Sea. You could trap the carbon in coal-fired power stations, pipe it out to old oil reserves, and that would be a neat solution. And then it turned out that the big fossil fuel producers, oil, gas, coal, were waiting for the government to come up with funding to innovate and to create the technologies, and there was an endless series of delays about funding. But these rich companies wanted public funding. And I remember saying to one or two of them, why don't you just fund this? I mean, it's in your own long-term interest to find a carbon capture solution. Why don't you do it? I mean, if over the last 20 years, they had all, the oil giants, put in a relatively small percentage of their profits into a shared fund, sprayed that money around universities and research centers, by now we possibly would have an effective carbon capture industry. And I was taken once to see a carbon capture pilot project in the States. And there was a bit of build-up to this by an oil company, and it said, well, you're very privileged to see this thing. And we drove for miles, and we got to a little, what looked like a fire hydrant, right? And it cost them $50,000. And I just said, this is out of all proportion to the scale of the challenge and to the scale of the money you're making.
Yeah, I mean, there does seem to be a bit of a dirty game going on, because the oil and gas companies are very quick to say, the policymakers set the playing field, and when they change the playing field, we'll change the way we do business. Until then, we'll just carry on doing what we're doing. And then it's like money to the policymakers to keep us on the same playing field. So we stay on the same playing field. We don't move anywhere. And they're kind of in cahoots, aren't they?
They are, and actually, I was just in Britain. There's quite a big campaign to say that we should have a windfall tax on the fossil fuel giants, and that money should go to help people tackle fuel poverty as we go into the winter. But sitting here, I'm thinking that's actually wrong, because where did Shell make some of their profits? They make some of their profits overseas in countries like Nigeria. So actually, the windfall tax, which we absolutely need, and it must tackle fuel poverty in the UK as the home of these giants, but it should also be going to those countries where they extract the oil from. And I wanted to give one positive example, Charles, because I think Ørsted's a really interesting company. It used to be Danish oil and gas company, 100% fossil fuels, and they're now something like 98% renewables. And I think we have to hang on to examples like that, who are the pioneers showing what can be done and in what indeed they all have to do.
Okay, so on the topic of fossil fuel companies and on the moral case, can I take questions on those two topics first, if there are any hands related to those two topics? And then okay, doesn't look like those two topics. People are wanting, okay, Felicity in the front. Microphone coming.
I just wanted you to expand, if you could. You were talking earlier about the social movements and this concept of victims that have come out of the industry. I know Adenike from Nigeria, this is something that is definitely happening in the global south, and I wondered if this was something that could be brought into the conversation a little bit more.
Thank you, Felicity. Adenike?
Sorry, please, can you come again?
So victimization as a result in the global south by the wealthy north, right? So, 4% of the world's population lives in the southern hemisphere. Some of you may know that. 96% in the northern hemisphere. And obviously that's where the pollution has been created, and the people who bear the brunt are mainly in the southern hemisphere. Victimization.
Okay, you mean victimization in what way? Sorry?
You were talking about what people in Nigeria have been experiencing as a direct result, and I wondered if you could elaborate on some of those environmental crises and talk a little bit more about this idea of victimization in the global south, and whether it's the case that people in the global south are working to do what they can against this, or if this is something that the global north have to have responsibility and accountability for. I would just like your thoughts on this more.
Okay, so definitely. Trying to look at it from two lenses, the Arctic and then in Africa. And first the Arctic, looking at the fact that we are having sea level rise. And while I was speaking with David yesterday, he got to show me the video of how the ice was melting at different stages. And it really tells a lot, because for every tons of carbons emitted, there is always 3 meters square of ice that is melted. And at the same time, this contributes to the sea level rise. Lagos already is going to be submerged with water by the end of the century. And also looking at it critically from the lens of Africa, that in Africa we are already bearing the brunt of the climate change crisis. We just contribute just 4% of emissions. And so that is really an injustice. But then we have abundant solar energy that we could harness if we have investment. And so instead of us channeling finance into fossil fuel and coal plants, it should be channeled into renewable and clean sources of energy that is aimed at sustainable development, because that is what we need. People want to just keep making profits, but those profit is really using to deal with the damage. But then the renewable sources of energy has nothing on loss and damage to do.
Yeah.
And so that is what we need to think to. We should portray those futures or those aspects. Because if we don't change, definitely it's going to get to a point where the climate change crisis will become irreversible. And that is why we need to keep our ambition of climate goals short term, so that we're able to actualize it. Like, what does each leader from the global West have to give in each of his leadership framework? Be it 4 years, 5 years, what do you want to give? We could not keep with all of this. The Shell, Chevron is already destroying our landscape in Nigeria. The Niger Delta crisis is all Shell and other multilateral companies, affecting the livelihoods of many people. And so we have to stop that.
Okay. Thank you, Adenika. Other questions? I just want to point out the $100 billion per annum that didn't materialize in Glasgow, even though it was agreed in Copenhagen, committed to. 100 billion per annum still hasn't materialized, and clearly that was a failure of Glasgow. We're hoping it's going to be a success here. But in England, I mean, we've got HS2 infrastructure project, high-speed rail, 120 billion pounds, one train line. And we're talking about $100 billion per annum from all the northern governments. It's pretty pathetic, isn't it? Adam, you have a question.
Charlie, thank you very much. Adam Bruce, Mainstream Renewable Power. We're a global developer of primarily wind and solar energy. I'd like to bring us back to the title, the energy story. How will we finally draw the curtain on the fossil fuel era? We need to tell a new story. We need a new story. David, almost as old as I am, will remember Sheikh Yamani, the Saudi oil minister from the 1970s, who was constantly on our television because in his hand he held the fate of many nations. And he was asked when he thought the oil age would run out. And he said in response, the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stone. The oil age won't run out because we run out of oil. It will run out because we find something better. We found something better. It's wind, it's solar, it's storage. Nobody owns the wind. Nobody owns the sun. We're going to transition from a few petrostates, as Giles said, to many electrostates who will own their own sunshine and generate electricity from their wind, which is essentially democratic, decentralized, diversified energy. And the barrier to that, what's holding us back is not the words required to tell the new story, it's putting them in order. It's the new energy system, it's the grid, it's the regulation, it's all the boring stuff, but the stuff that needs to be sorted here and financed here, because the private sector will finance the wind and the sun, whether it's microgrids, off-grids, or large scale. But we can't shoehorn that energy into systems that were built for hydrocarbons. We need new systems, and that's what needs to be designed and agreed here.
Thank you, Adam. And I like the way you put that, because basically you were referring to the move from molecules to electrons, weren't you, in that change of system. But just going back to the stick, I mean, we still need to be, like with banning of smoking in public places, it happened. And actually, most people seem to think it was a good thing. Surely we still need to, as the public, pressure more from governments on the stick of, let's use that word, banning certain things happening that we know are detrimental. And I mean, how can we vote people in? I mean, in the UK, for example, but in Nigeria, I mean, it's a difficult business, whether it's a democracy or not, of voting people in who are going to be courageous enough to pass the sort of legislation. I mean, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill is waiting to go through Parliament in the UK at the moment. There are only 4 Conservative MPs that support it, even though all of the other parties support it.
I think the reality is political sensitivity and nervousness, and which means that carrot is more plausible than stick. And I think the example of offshore wind, not often I would find myself saying this, but Boris Johnson was right, that the right structure was created 20 odd years ago in the UK to create the incentives for brilliant engineering companies, Ørsted among them, to come in and exploit shallow seas around the UK that are mostly always windy, to put up experimentally initially these wind turbines. I mean, I remember filming Britain's first offshore wind turbines off the coast of Northumberland, 2003. A lot of experts I consulted said, well, they're going to fall over in the first North Sea storm. They'll always be too expensive. 10 years later, I was climbing a 100-meter tall turbine tower in the Irish Sea, what was then the biggest offshore wind farm in the world, then the biggest turbines in the world. And the experts said, okay, yeah, it does work. They don't fall over, but it's still too expensive. Now, as we're hearing, it's the cheapest form of power in the UK, 9 times cheaper than gas. I mean, I think the case has been made for government regulation, but emphasizing incentive rather than restrictions, involving and encouraging the great engineering innovations and brilliance, and then showing the public, look, it's worth doing this. Your bills are lower as a result.
And on exactly that point, I mean, can you tell us, Harriet, about what is the Power Up campaign all about?
Oh, thanks, Charles. Well, so far, over 45 organizations from the global big boys like SE for All or Gogla, Clean Cooking Alliance, have come together with grassroots, small and medium-sized enterprises who are developing distributed rural energy to say, how can we put access to clean energy at the heart of the COP talks? So that the focus is on how do we scale down fossil fuels, but equally in the opposite, we need to scale up renewables. In fact, you need to do that first to take the place of fossil fuels and to reach all those people who still have no access to energy. And so I really hope that I can come and give you all a postcard.
Yes.
We have a postcards here that you'll join the campaign, that you'll tweet about it, so that just as nature rose up the agenda at COP26, we can make sure that access to clean energy does the same at COP27. And I think, Charles, to help make that happen, I would agree, of course we need sticks, but we also need the finance to flow to make renewable energy affordable to all those people in Africa who can't afford it. And that, I think, comes back to loss and damage. That's why loss and damage is such a critical part of this COP. That's why making sure the 100 billion per year that was meant to be on the table really does start to flow, and that replaces subsidies to fossil fuel companies, which unbelievably are just going up still, that instead we're subsidizing distributed democratic rural energy. And just to give you one example, a brilliant company in Soulshare in Bangladesh, and what they've trialed is a new way where I have a solar panel on my house. I can sell energy to Charles, who then can sell to David and Adanika, and then when we've got more than we need, we can sell to the next village, and they can sell to the next village. So you really get that kind of network sense of distributed energy. But those kind of initiatives also need, as you said, the policy backup to enable that to happen.
Excellent. I'm going to wind this up unless there's a burning question. There's one more from the audience, but before I go to that last question, I'll read out the website of the Power Up campaign, because I've got one of these in my inside pocket. It's powerupnow.org. Please sign up. I mean, it would be great if a lot of you could sign up to that campaign. And it is good, as you said, that loss and damage is on the agenda. Let's have an optimism, because, as they say, outrage and optimism is what we need, right? Right, last question.
Hello, just a quick question. In the same vein as some of the things you've been talking about, with this $100 billion commitment, Boris Johnson said that countries in the global north cannot be relied on to basically fund reparations in the global south. Fiscally, he said it's just not pragmatic. I wonder what are some of your responses to that attitude?
Who would like to take that on first? Adanika?
Okay, I think it's really unfair Because if the global west or the global north cannot fund, then why did you make the commitment at first instance? Because it should be $100 billion annual commitment since the 2009 to 2020. Now that amount of money can't even meet up with the current loss and damage. So the more we don't keep up with our commitment, the greater the loss and damage. So we just have to find ways to meet up with those commitments, because I feel it's really unfair. Like currently, Nigeria have passed its climate change bill into law. And so we need a lot of support, investment to see how we could scale through, to see that we have renewable sources of energy. We change into a quick, rapid society that will help to better the society at large. At the same time, I think it came when we activists was campaigning actively for the climate change bill to be signed into law, because I remember I carried a postal. Then I was campaigning every Friday to see that the government tried to see how they could pass the bill. So with the help of different ministry and the rest, they passed the bill. I think it's one of the sources of it, trying to see how we could campaign, just as you said, that you could sign up to see how they can campaign to make power for all, energy for all. Instead of using the carbon market, we could buy into the clean energy market, where even the polluters could come in and also try to transit into a cleaner energy sources. And so it's really unfair to hear that statement from Boris Johnson. It's really not, it shouldn't be. I wrote an article that was out yesterday talking about the fact that instead of not making a commitment a reality, it's even better not to make the commitment at first, because we have all been waiting for the finance to deal with the climate change crisis. And it should be, we have to find ways to fund it.
And that's in The Independent, isn't it? That article.
What?
The article.
Yeah.
In The Independent, yes, indeed. Thank you, Adenika. So we are going to wind up now. So I think you'll all agree, audience, that these three amazing people do amazing work on this important topic, vital topic. So could you please join me in thanking my esteemed panel? And then just to say, on behalf of my company, Rise, and on behalf of Kite, who we've partnered with, I'd like to thank you all for joining this session. And just also, finally, to mention the Arctic Angels. Please look up the Arctic Angels through Global Choices and speak to Felicity from Global Choices if you have a chance, because what they're doing is really important in terms of establishing a moratorium in the Arctic for no industrial activity. So you can find out more about that. And thank you to Adenika representing the Arctic Angels on that point. Thank you so much, everybody.